Welcome back everyone. Today we continue with the next part of this series called What If Future Gohan Was Never Killed by the Androids. Let's aim for 350 likes on this one. Also, don't forget to leave a comment letting me know if you've enjoyed the series so far. With that, let's begin. Gohan wasn't dead, at least he didn't think he was. The elder Demisane had often wondered about death and had asked his father, Goku, about it. Goku had described it as not too different from being alive, especially since he had kept his body due to his good deeds. Gohan remembered tales of a land resting upon clouds, where King Yema decided whether you went to eternal paradise or faced hell for your crimes. But what Gohan was experiencing was nothing like that. Everything around him was pitch black, his sight and hearing stripped away, leaving an eerie silence. He tried to move, but he couldn't tell if he was accomplishing anything. It felt like he was floating in space, with nothing to touch, see, or hear. Strangely, he still had his senses of smell and taste. He could feel his breath on his tongue and the air as it entered his nostrils. Time seemed to crawl at half its usual pace, making him feel trapped in this condition for an eternity. His first coherent thought was, what happened? Where am I? What happened to the Ice Djinns? But these thoughts soon faded as he slipped into madness from the isolation. Unable to express his panic made things worse, and he felt trapped within his own mind, a place he'd never been stuck before. Once he calmed down a bit, he focused on the senses he still had. He noticed a strange, bitter scent. Unsure if he was opening his mouth, he tried to remember the motion. He felt a cool air on his tongue, meaning he had succeeded. This small victory, being able to sense something from the outside world, was a relief. For what felt like centuries, he continued this action. The ability to smell wasn't enough to make up for his other losses, but it was something. As time dragged on, Gohan began to wonder if this was indeed hell. He remembered his failures and the tortures he inflicted on aliens before his battle with the enhanced Ice Djinns. Was that enough to deserve this punishment? Anything seemed better than being unable to feel. During his madness, Gohan longed for the touch of his mother when he was younger. He remembered wrapping his arms around her soft figure, the satisfying and heartwarming hug that always made him feel better. He continued down the long corridor of his memories and stumbled upon the time his neck had been broken by the monstrous Rikum. That painful experience seemed almost preferable to the strange torture he was enduring now. Back then, the pain and terror had confirmed his existence, but now, he had no idea if he was even alive. Was this the fate of those who hadn't been deemed heroes by King Yema? The worst part of this torture was the uncertainty. Gohan was unsure of where he was, what had happened, why he was here, or even if he was alive. Suddenly, Gohan noticed a change. The bitter smell that had filled his nostrils was replaced by a musty, stale scent, like the kind you'd find in a doctor's office. He realized his tongue was still extended and felt a change in the air. There was now a breeze pressing against his tongue. Could this mean he was moving? Excitement filled Gohan's mind as he realized he might be moving. But where to? Fear began to creep in. What if he was being sent to his doom? What if he was being tortured without knowing it? So many what-ifs filled his mind, fueling his fear. But then, he thought, anything is better than this. Please, take me out of this void of nothingness. He longed to be touched, to feel a hug, or even to be punched if it meant release from this isolation. He felt the breeze on his tongue slow until it faded to nothing, indicating that any movement had stopped. Or perhaps he had imagined it all and hadn't moved an inch. Maybe what he felt was just a simple breeze, and he was still stuck in the same place. But where is that even? Gohan wondered, finally considering the idea of the outside world. The last thing he remembered were the two Ice Djinns standing over him with their confident grins. Was he still lying there in the rubble? Or had he been blasted moments after losing consciousness? Was this what happened when you were vaporized by a ki blast? Ki blasts were different from regular explosions. They carried the life force of another being. Perhaps it sent you to another dimension, different from death. Gohan had seen stranger things. He remembered when Garlic Jr. had opened a portal to the Dead Zone, a place of nothingness. Gohan imagined it was similar to this. As he seriously considered this thought, he realized how many people he might have sent here. He had vaporized plenty of enemies, and the invasion alone would account for hundreds. Gohan dismissed this idea soon after. He remembered that Chaozu had killed himself with an explosive ki blast and had never mentioned a void like this. When Gohan asked Tien about Chaozu's death, Tien said Chaozu had been with him on King Kai's planet, meaning a ki blast couldn't have caused this void. His thoughts were interrupted as he tasted a strange liquid trickling across his tongue. Gohan had no idea what the substance was but eagerly lapped it up, trying to swallow it. His throat. Gohan could feel the liquid going down his throat. What a glorious feeling it was. He had never thought a simple drink could be so uplifting. After a few more seconds, the liquid stopped, leaving him to decide what he had just consumed. It was lukewarm with a terrible taste that would normally make him gag, but right now, it was like sweet honey mixed with nice tea. The shock and significant change made Gohan start to believe that he might be alive after all. Perhaps my friends have recovered my body and are trying to revive me. Gohan wanted to send a message that he was aware of their efforts but had no way to communicate other than his nose and tongue. He tried to wiggle his nose, but without a sense of feeling. He couldn't tell if he was accomplishing anything. Then, he tried to wiggle his tongue. To his surprise and delight, he was rewarded with another dose of the strange liquid. He lapped it up hungrily, examining it further. It still tasted terrible, but he realized it burned his tongue slightly, similar to toothpaste when he was younger. Strange that this memory comes to me now. He remembered how, a year after returning from Namek, he transitioned from children's toothpaste to adult toothpaste like his parents used. The first time he brushed with the new toothpaste, he immediately spat it out and rinsed his mouth with several gulps of water. Funny how a boy who had faced the tyrant of galaxies was unwilling to endure the slight burn of toothpaste. Gohan smiled at the childish memory, fond of the break he had between fighting Frieza and dealing with the androids. Wait, did I just? The Demi-Sen suddenly became aware that he could now feel his lips. Happily, he began to move them about, realizing he had the opportunity to talk. He took a sharp intake of breath as he realized he could communicate again. Gohan shaped his lips and tongue, trying to say, "The serum is working." He didn't know how loud or quiet his voice was, but he felt the vibrations in his throat. He decided to raise his voice until he almost heard the vibrations emanating from his voice box. Gohan was interrupted as a third dose of the strange liquid was poured onto his moving lips, spilling down his now touch-sensitive cheeks, bringing a smile to his face. He could now control his lips and jaw, meaning he could open his mouth to consume more of the liberating medicine. He guzzled the disgusting drink with vigor before realizing that the liquid was telling him more than he thought. There was no nozzle, so the medicine was definitely being poured down on him, indicating he was looking upward. He couldn't determine the position of the rest of his body, but he certainly enjoyed having a sense of direction again. He guessed he was probably lying on his back with Bulma above him, pouring the miracle drink down his throat. This process continued for about half an hour, with 15-second intervals between each sip, Gohan had counted. Then he began to hear things. They weren't the noises he had expected. There was a lot of ambiance with several beeping sounds, again reminding Gohan of a medical facility. He gave a few shouts and oddly enough could hear a distinct echo as his voice reflected back to him. It wasn't the echo you'd hear if you shouted down a tunnel. It was too suppressed. The only thing Gohan could compare it to was yelling into a small jar and hearing his voice bounce off the circular walls. He shouted again, focusing this time on his actual voice rather than the distracting echo. He realized how hoarse and strained his speech was, like he was recovering from a severe cold, or talking after an unnaturally long silence. This idea scared Gohan as he suddenly realized he had no idea how long he'd been in whatever container he was in. He remembered the events with the ice djinns as if they were yesterday, but that could only mean he'd been asleep far longer than he thought. What if weeks had gone by in this sludge-like fluid? What if the invasion was already resolved and Trunks hadn't been able to save himself from the evils of the ice djinns Gohan had failed to destroy? What if everyone he loved and cared for had been killed during the attack? What if once he recovered, there was nothing to go back to? What if, when he recovered, he wasn't allowed to go back? Gohan's greatest enemy, uncertainty, returned with a vengeance as worries and doubts flooded his mind. Nothing scared him more than losing what little he still had left. His grandfather the Ox King, Bulma and the gang, his little brother Trunks. These were the things he cherished most and drove him to continue even in his darkest moments. If he lost these people in his life, he didn't know what he would do. What would he fight for if there was nothing left? What would drive him if everything he loved was gone? Would it even be worth living if nothing he lived for remained? These questions haunted Gohan, keeping him awake at night. The Ox King was getting older and would soon pass away, leaving Gohan as the last living member of his dwindling family line. Bulma was still young, but compared to a Saiyan's lifespan, she wouldn't be around as long. The only person Gohan counted on outliving him was Trunks, the boy who shared the most in common with him and who had the stubborn genes of Vegeta. This thought comforted him during times of depression. However, he was constantly reminded of the harsh reality they lived in, a world where only the strongest survived, and the weak, no matter how close they were to being stronger, were wiped out. Gohan worried about Trunks constantly. He understood Trunks' drive to fight but knew the teen could easily die in battle if he wasn't careful. This was why Gohan had originally sided with Bulma about letting him fight. Recently, however, the Elder Sen had grown more lenient. allowing Trunks to accompany him in battles against threats to Earth. There was no doubt Gohan still disapproved of fighting. Gohan laughed at himself. Funny how Earth's best warrior disliked fighting, despite his life. He trained constantly, fought constantly, and developed new strategies and moves nearly every day, yet none of it appealed to him. He never fought for pleasure as his father and the rest of the Z warriors did. He only took up the practice when Earth was in danger, promising himself he'd quit once peace was achieved. But peace, Gohan had learned, was never to come. Gohan decided to change the topic in his mind and focus on the other sounds he could hear as his hearing grew clearer by the second, eventually returning to its usual precision. Again, he found nothing but the occasional beep and dripping noises whenever the doses of medicine came and splattered against his lips or eager tongue. There were occasional footsteps and faint murmurs, but he could never tell their direction or what the voices were saying. This made the Demisane nervous and prompted him to stop his experimental shouts. He didn't know what these people would do if they realized he was conscious. If it wasn't Bulma behind this healing process, he didn't want to draw attention to himself. Besides that, he could hear nothing out of the ordinary. Strangely, when he first regained the feeling in his ears, he could have sworn something wet was dripping on his earlobe. 3 hours later, Gohan hadn't known it since he had no sense of time, but during this experience, he had been falling in and out of sleep. Each time he awoke, something new had reawakened. First, he was able to wiggle and feel his fingers. To his surprise, Gohan realized he was in a pool of some sort of liquid. He shook his fingers vigorously, determining that the thickness and texture of the substance were similar to what he'd drunk before. Was he soaking in the same medicine he had eagerly consumed just hours ago? 2 hours later, after several more doses of the terrible drink, Gohan had finally regained almost all the feeling in his face and parts of his neck. Though he could tell he was opening his eyes, he still lacked sight. This didn't bother him. All his other senses had been slowly returning, so he had no doubt he would soon be able to see and finally understand his predicament. His toes had regained feeling during this time, revealing shocking news. At the start of this slow process of regaining senses, he determined the direction of up from where the medicine drink had been poured, indicating some sort of gravity. Once his neck regained partial feeling, he realized he was forced to look up, dismissing his previous thought of lying horizontally on a table. He knew at least his torso was positioned vertically. The thick watery substance was up to his neck, close to where his throat met his shoulders. This meant from his shoulders down, he was completely submerged in the medicine. What shocked Gohan when he regained feeling in his feet was that he felt nothing but the same syrupy substance his fingers swam in. This meant his entire body was vertically submerged in this strange fluid. Had he been sitting upright inside a regular horizontal tub, he would have felt the bottom with his heels. The second image he formed, after dismissing the idea of being laid flat on a table, disappeared as he now imagined he had been placed in some sort of tube. This worried him greatly, as he had never seen Bulma with test tubes large enough to fit him in. No longer did the Demisaiyan believe he was in the care of his longtime friend Bulma. Someone or something else must have gotten hold of his dying body before the Ice Djinns could complete their task. Whoever or whatever had decided to cure the poison in his body had unknown intentions. Worry settled in the pit of Gohan's stomach as his mind raced with possibilities of what might happen once he was healed. 6 hours later, Gohan realized he was to be moved from his medical container. He now understood that his situation was dire and in no way safe. Between the time he figured out that his situation might be far less safe than he initially thought and this incident, Gohan had recovered feeling in several body parts. The feeling in his feet had transferred up his legs to the point where he could barely wiggle his weak legs from the knee down. His arms had recovered more drastically. His fingers were no longer the only appendages he could move. That's right, arms, both of them. Gohan couldn't understand how, but soon after his right hand woke up from its nap, he began to experience a strange tingling sensation from his left. After finally winning the struggle to control his dominant arm, he slowly rubbed his opposite shoulder where the tingling occurred. To his surprise, when he tried to scratch his armpit by looping his fingers underneath the stump, he found some resistance. The Demisaiyan jerked at the feeling, surprised by his own arm. Slowly and cautiously, Gohan's hand slid down and felt the long-forgotten limb. He was afraid he'd apply too much pressure and somehow snap the frail and thin arm, far weaker than his other arm which had learned to compensate for his loss over time. This didn't displease Gohan in the slightest because it was there. The arm he'd lost months ago was finally back, and he loved it. All sense of caution left Gohan as he released a thunderous shout of happiness. Cheering, he wanted to flex and test out the new arm, but he had yet to regain full control over it. He waited both excitedly and merrily for the chance to test out this new treat. After this discovery, not a single dose of the medicine dispensed from above went to waste. His drive to speed up the healing process multiplied tenfold. His excitement grew so much that he began to contemplate whether or not he should start scooping up and drinking the liquid he rested in to speed up the process. He'd done a taste test earlier, and confirmed it was indeed the same fluid being poured from above him. He seriously considered this before deciding against it. The only thing that stopped him was the thought that during his sleep, he must have been at least peeing from all the liquid he was consuming. Though he didn't doubt the cleanliness of the facility, he had yet to regain feeling in his genital and stomach regions, and didn't want to risk it if he were indeed peeing in the medicine. I'm not that desperate, Gohan thought, both amused and pleased as the joy from the recovery of his arm flowed through his body. Much later, when he finally began to move his weakened arm about in the thick fluid, he began to hear muffled voices near his container. He'd outstretched his arms before and felt that the walls were smooth and curved inward, meeting at the top, giving Gohan the idea that his medical canister was egg-shaped. He could tell there were at least two voices talking to each other, and based on what little he could decipher, they were talking about him. One voice was raspy and higher in pitch, leading Gohan to believe it might be female by Earth standards. The second voice was deeper, but as they spoke, Gohan noticed a nervous stutter. Was this second voice scared of something? Gohan listened closer, trying to make out the words. Is he ready? The raspy voice asked, sounding impatient. Almost just a bit more time, the deeper voice replied, clearly anxious. He's recovering faster than expected. Gohan's heart pounded. Who are these people? What do they want with me? He strained to hear more, catching snippets of their conversation. We need him. The plan won't fail. Too important. Gohan's mind raced. He needed to regain full control of his body and get out of this place, wherever it was. The raspy voice continued, now sounding more urgent. Make sure he doesn't suspect. A second voice, sharp and feminine, cut through the air with irritation. We don't have 3 days to spare. He's been healing for 2 whole days already. He should be ready for us to extract what we need. The first voice grew clearer, now filled with more confidence. My queen, we risk extracting damaged cells from the poison if we rush this. So far, every other subject has only regained their sense of taste and smell, indicating their bodies are still poisoned. They must have never used the poison on Saiyans before, Gohan thought, wiggling his fingers and toes slightly. He did it briefly, not wanting to reveal he was recovering faster than expected. He didn't know their intentions yet, so he continued to listen. To his surprise, the second voice echoed his thoughts. Doctor, you've never tested on Saiyans before. You don't understand how quickly they recover. Gohan heard a tapping sound, like a finger on glass, followed by the feminine voice again. You're listening to us, aren't you? I saw your finger twitch just now. No doubt your hearing is back too. Crap, Gohan thought, panic rising. He hadn't realized they could see him inside whatever egg-shaped pod he was in. The doctor's voice interrupted, skeptical. No offense, my queen, but that's ridiculous. There's no way he's recovered enough to make such movements. A light chuckle came from the queen before she responded. Check the patient recordings, doctor. I assure you, you'll find significant movement inside his tank. Gohan heard the doctor sigh, then obediently say, yes, my queen. His footsteps echoed away until Grandpa Gohan could no longer hear them. In the silence that followed, he pieced together who the voice belonged to. Queen Cold. I've been captured by Queen Cold. Soon, the Ice Jin's voice addressed him directly. I know you've recovered enough to hear me and respond. There's no point in hiding it. It won't change your fate. Gohan remained silent, trying to think of a plan. You're undoubtedly confused. Perhaps if I explained a few things, you'd be more willing to talk. I'd love to hear about your pain and suffering firsthand. Gohan decided to stay quiet despite Queen Cold's words. After several seconds, he heard a frustrated sigh and the alien say, fine, remain silent as long as you please. I know you can hear me, and there's no doubt you also know who I am. But in case you're too slow to figure it out, I am the dreaded Queen Cold you've heard so much about. I mothered Frieza and Cooler while ruling the universe with my husband, whom your father so rudely killed. She paused, as if gathering her thoughts, then added, wait, I want to make sure you're listening. I want you to understand why the pain and torture you will soon endure is justified. You need to know that everything you receive is well-deserved. You are not innocent. Another prolonged silence followed, her voice now dripping with anger and vengeance. Your lack of response will not deter me from explaining why you deserve to die. Gohan fought to keep his lips from forming a smile. He could tell the Ice Jin was getting annoyed. Fine, I don't need an ape's foul tongue anyway. Now where was I? Ah yes, your father slaughtering my husband. In fact, your father also managed to kill both my sons before selfishly dying before I got the chance to get a hold of him. When I learned he was deceased all those years ago, I decided to leave this planet alone. I knew of the two cyborgs who'd begun killing your father's allies along with the people of Earth and decided it was a fitting punishment for the pain your father put me through. There was a pause as Queen Cold took a breath before continuing. I kept a watchful eye on your little planet, making sure these robots' rampages went on without much resistance. Of course, there were your futile efforts, but as I watched, I realized how much agony and pain they put you through. I decided again to let it be. I thought it so kind that the universe had decided to punish you and your planet's inhabitants for your father's mistakes without any need for my input. She gave another dark chuckle, the sound sending shivers down Grandpa Gohan's spine. As he listened, he realized he had heard the same laugh when he fought Shiny. When Shiny had poisoned him, he couldn't help but presume that somehow this ice djinn had been controlling the suit that led to his fragility. Gohan was unable to put any more thought to this idea as Queen Cold continued with her story. Later, much later, once I'd assumed that the torture being inflicted on your planet would last for an eternity, something happened. Something that put a, what is your Earth saying? Put a wrench in things, I believe it is? The ice djinn waited an awkward few seconds before realizing she wasn't going to receive an answer. She grumbled, frustrated. This would be a lot more satisfying if I could tell you were listening. Again, she was met with no response. Fine then, I will continue on without your input, you dumb monkey, she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. I discovered that one of the cyborgs had been killed, and since their strength came from their numbers, I knew it was only a matter of time before the second one was destroyed as well. There was a pause and Gohan started to hear a tapping noise. It sounded like fingers knocking against his glass container. She could see him, and the tapping was getting on his nerves. I've heard fish dislike it when you flick their glass tank, she continued, the tapping still in the background. Perhaps it will have a similar effect on you. Anyhow, it was then that I readied my troops to invade your planet. It took only a day to reach your sun, and we've been watching you ever since. Wait, a few days after 17 died, why didn't I sense them? Gohan thought angrily. Surely, if a force that large was heading toward Earth, he would have felt it. He searched his memory, trying to find any hint of this invasion. Then he realized, during the days Then why didn't Trunks sense it? He wondered. His thought interrupted itself as he remembered that Trunks had also been badly injured and probably unconscious for several days. Plus, Trunks had only just begun to understand how to sense Kai's signatures before their training a month later. Even if he had been awake, he likely wouldn't have sensed anything. Gohan quietly scolded himself for not teaching Trunks sooner. He promised himself that he wouldn't neglect the teen's training anymore. Even if Bulma disapproved, he needed Trunks' help to keep Earth safe. The Ice Djinn continued her story, her voice filled with a strange happiness as she relieved a prideful memory. Then we simply had to pick our time. After some waiting and stealth, knowing you would sense us if we orbited your atmosphere, we saw your battle with the large android and realized this was the time to attack. And attack we did, and the slaughter was glorious. Her voice trailed off as she lost herself in the memory. Gohan's sharp ears picked up on footsteps quickly approaching, followed by the familiar voice of the doctor. You were right, my queen, the doctor said. It seems the patient has regained the use of his arms and legs, along with the entirety of his senses, excluding sight, or so we believe. The doctor's next words were directed at Gohan, filled with annoyance. We have your shouting and flailing around on tape, Saiyan Mutt. You might as well answer the queen since we know you can. Gohan took a few moments to consider his options. He didn't have much to hide, but he thought it best if they believed he was still unconscious. He remained silent, hoping they would be fooled. After several seconds of silence, the doctor spoke again. It seems he's either refusing to speak to us or unconscious. It's not uncommon for patients under this medication to fall in and out of sleep. Somehow, I doubt that, the queen replied confidently. Did you catch another movement, my queen? The doctor asked curiously. No, but I have a hunch. Gohan heard footsteps echoing away from his container, but they didn't sound like the doctor's footsteps. Was the Ice Djinn leaving? Queen Cold's fading voice reached Gohan as she commanded, take him out. The operation starts now. Gohan's world spun as he suddenly felt the ground give way beneath him. The harsh screech of metal scraping against metal filled his ears, and before he could react, his fragile, aching body tumbled down onto an icy steel floor. The cold bite of the surface sent a shiver through him, his skin still raw from being submerged in the rejuvenating fluid earlier. The shattered remnants of the medicinal tub sloshed around him, and he winced at the sudden impact. Almost instantly, Gohan felt strong hands, rough and unkind, yank him upwards. They slid underneath his armpits, hoisting him like dead weight. He couldn't fight back, his body far too weak to resist as they plopped him onto a hard metallic stretcher. Straps were quickly fastened across his frail frame, and without warning, the stretcher began moving, gliding smoothly along the floor. The motion hit him like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned, and before he could stop himself, the contents of his stomach surged upwards. Gohan gagged and turned his head to the side, retching over the edge of the stretcher. The sickening sound of his vomit splattering on the cold ground was met with a chorus of angry grumbles from the creatures carrying him. "Watch it, you filthy sane mutt," one of them snarled, its voice harsh and gravelly. Gohan flinched as a meaty hand came crashing down on the back of his head, sending a sharp pain through his skull. "I ain't getting this stink all over my clothes." Gohan's trembling hands instinctively reached up to the sore spot where he'd been struck. His fingers gently massaged the area, though it did little to soothe the throbbing ache. He couldn't see the aliens clearly, but their foul tempers were evident enough. Still, as he lay there, vulnerable and bound, his curiosity itched at him. They were moving deeper into the ship, and even in his weakened state, Gohan couldn't help but wonder what the inside of this alien craft looked like. The faint sounds of footfalls echoed through the halls, suggesting that the ship's interior wasn't all that different from a human spacecraft. Hallways, perhaps similar rooms. It didn't seem as exotic as Gohan had hoped. Still, there had to be some remarkable differences, things beyond his current senses. He longed to know what kind of technology these beings used, how their craft operated. Would there be surprises around every corner, hidden mechanisms or alien wonders? Despite himself, Gohan cracked open his eyes, hoping for some kind of answer. But the moment he did, he regretted it. A blazing light seared his retinas, so bright and intense it felt as though his very soul was being set on fire. He screamed out in agony, his voice echoing through the metallic corridors. His eyes snapped shut, tears leaking down his cheeks. What was that? Did someone just use a solar flare? His outburst earned him another brutal response. A fist slammed into his chest with such force that his breath was knocked clean out of him. He gasped, struggling to drag air back into his lungs. The pain was unbearable, and he coughed weakly, trying to regain his composure. "Shut your mouth," the same gruff voice barked at him. "I ain't gonna tell you again. You keep squawking, and I'll beat you so bad, you won't be able to spit out another word." A second voice chimed in, this one raspy and unpleasant. It was the kind of voice that came from someone who'd spent their whole life inhaling smoke. "Yeah, little sane runt, I'll be more than happy to join in on the fun. You almost got that puke all over me back there." Gohan shrank back as much as he could, though the restraints held him firmly in place. His heart pounded in his chest, and despite the fear and pain, a small, defiant thought flickered in his mind. "Like hell the two of you could stand a chance against me if I wasn't so weak right now." He desperately tried to tap into his ki, hoping to sense just how strong these aliens were, but it was useless. His energy reserves were so low that he couldn't even manage the simple act of sensing ki, let alone gather enough to defend himself. His body had been through too much, and he was still far from recovering. Gohan squinted, trying once again to open his eyes, but the harsh brightness made it almost unbearable. The searing light stung, but this time he fought through the pain. Slowly, his eyes began to adjust. Shadows and shapes started to take form, and finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he managed to open them a little more. The world around him still felt too bright, almost like staring directly into the sun, but he could see now. For a brief moment, Gohan wanted to shout in triumph. He wanted to cheer just for the simple fact that he could see again, but he held back, reminding himself that any sudden noise or excitement might earn him another blow. The memory of the last hit still stung, and he had no interest in a repeat performance. Looking around, he realized that only two aliens were carrying him now, one at his feet and one at his head. The alien at his head loomed over him, a large round creature with red skin that bore a striking resemblance to Dodoria, though this one was even more grotesque. Its massive fists clenched by its sides, and Gohan shuddered at the thought. "This one must have been the one that hit me," he thought grimly. With a great deal of effort, Gohan tried lifting his head. It felt like an impossible task, as if centuries had passed since he'd last moved. His neck ached as if it had forgotten how to function, but at last, he managed to lift his head just enough to glance at the alien holding his feet. This one was much smaller, green-skinned, and impish, reminding Gohan of a tiny version of the towering Namekians he knew so well. Groaning softly, he let his head fall back onto the cold, hard surface beneath him. He realized then that it wasn't even a stretcher they were using to carry him. It was a flat, steel board, cold, unyielding, and completely unsuited for anyone needing medical care. Great health service, Gohan thought sarcastically, trying to focus on something other than the dread gnawing at him. The word operation echoed in his mind, ever since Queen Cold had uttered it. He knew there was nothing good waiting for him on that operating table. They continued down the narrow halls, and despite the fear bubbling up inside him, Gohan's mind wandered. He noticed thick wires running along the ceiling, twisting and winding in seemingly random directions. Occasionally, another alien would cross their path, and whenever one did, Gohan, fueled by a strange mixture of defiance and amusement, would snarl at them. The result was always the same. The aliens would leap back in fear, their eyes wide with terror. It was clear that even in his weakened state, Gohan's reputation had preceded him. These creatures saw him as the ruthless warrior who had taken down countless enemies, and he couldn't help but find some dark amusement in it. The two aliens carrying him certainly seemed entertained. The red-skinned brute would chuckle deeply, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. The smaller alien, the one that reminded him of a tiny Namekian, giggled each time Gohan made one of their comrades jump. After a while, it seemed like they were purposely taking longer routes, passing through more crowded areas just to watch Gohan frighten more of the unsuspecting workers. They'd burst out laughing whenever one would stumble back or let out a yelp. Even Gohan, though scared out of his mind about what lay ahead, couldn't help but let a small smirk cross his lips. He knew it was ridiculous, almost childish, but if stalling them meant delaying whatever horrible operation was planned, then he'd snarl at 100 more aliens. The fun didn't last long, though. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed through the halls, vibrating through the walls. Have the sane patient transferred to the surgical ward immediately. Repercussions will be dealt to those who delay this order. The tiny green alien's eyes widened, and he let out a nervous laugh. Uh-oh, he squeaked. Looks like we've been taken too long. The red-skinned one grunted, the humor draining from his face. Welp, fun's over, it looks like, he said with a gruff chuckle, though it lacked the earlier warmth. He reached down and patted Gohan on the head, the way someone might pat a dog. Good while it lasted. Huh, nice knowin' ya, mutt. Gohan gave a weak nod in response, feeling a pit form in his stomach. His heart pounded faster as they resumed their walk in silence. When Gohan was finally brought into the surgical room, he was shifted off the stretcher and onto a larger, imposing steel table. As he tried to move, he felt the cold bite of the steel cables that restrained his wrists and ankles, locking him in place. He winced slightly, the cold metal digging into his skin. His eyes darted around the room. The place was sterile but unsettling, with various counters neatly arranged with bizarre instruments, strange tools that Gohan couldn't even begin to comprehend. They glimmered under the harsh, sterile lights, their sharp edges and strange designs making his skin crawl. He had a sinking feeling that none of these devices were intended to be used gently. Standing around him were three beings that could only be described as doctors, though Gohan doubted any real healing was in their plans. Each wore an all-white suit that encased their entire bodies, almost like the radiation suits he had seen on Earth. Their faces were exposed, though, and Gohan couldn't help but feel a shiver run down his spine as he observed them. The one closest to him had a strange growth protruding from both sides of its head, with a sickly purple tint to its skin. The other two looked similar to each other, both sporting inch-long horns jutting out from their foreheads and bumpy teal skin. They moved in eerie unison, prepping the tools in a practiced manner that sent Gohan's mind reeling. Trying to distract himself, Gohan glanced to the far corner of the room, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw what appeared to be Cooler leaning casually against the wall. His first instinct was to panic, but a second look revealed the differences. This being's skin wasn't the familiar purple that Cooler had sported, but instead a dark, almost midnight blue. Their eyes met for a brief moment. The Ice Jin gave him a wicked smirk, then jerked his head towards the other side of the room. Gohan hesitated but followed the gesture, his eyes landing on another figure standing silently in the shadows. This one was slimmer, her frame draped in a long black dress adorned with gleaming metals, giving her an air of undeniable authority and power. There was no mistaking her. This was Queen Cold. Gohan stared at her, studying her face, and instantly recognized the family resemblance. Her features echoed those of Frieza and Cooler, the same slim, sharp jawline that Frieza had in his final form. Her head bore a purple dome-like structure, much like Frieza's, and her skin was primarily pink, with her forearms protected by white armor-like coverings similar to Cooler's in his transformed states. But what stood out most were the deep purple lines running down from the corners of her eyes, like permanent streaks of tears carved into her face. Her lips were painted a dark, almost sinister blue, and even though her posture was regal, The fine lines under her eyes and on her arms betrayed her age. She was older than her sons, and though time had worn her down slightly, she still exuded an intimidating presence. The moment their eyes locked, a cold, predatory smile crept across Queen Cold's lips. She took a step forward, crossing her arms as she approached Gohan with slow, deliberate movements. Her eyes sparkled with twisted pleasure. "Prepare yourself, Sen," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "Now begins the painful part." Before Gohan could even think to react, the procedure began. His screams echoed down the long corridors of the ship, a haunting sound that reverberated off the cold metal walls. 1 hour later, Gohan lay drenched in sweat, his body trembling from the sheer exhaustion of it all. Large beads of sweat slid down his forehead, dripping onto the steel table and mingling with the pool of blood that had gathered below. His body ached in ways he hadn't thought possible, every nerve alight with burning pain. The procedure had been brutal. They started by cutting into his limbs, just beneath the muscle, not too deep at first, but without his Kai to help him suppress the pain. Even the shallow cuts felt excruciating. Each time a blade pierced his skin, his body would jolt reflexively, though the restraints held him tightly in place. The worst part wasn't the cuts themselves, but what followed. After the initial incision, they inserted a long, strange syringe into the open wound, carefully extracting a vial of blood from deep within his muscle. It wasn't pleasant, but Gohan had managed to bite his tongue and bear it. But then, they returned to the same spot, cutting deeper this time, another half-inch into the already raw and sensitive muscle. That's when the real pain started. Gohan's screams echoed louder as the blade sliced through his flesh, hitting the tender muscle tissue. The syringe would then dive in again, taking another vial of blood before they moved even deeper. Eventually, they reached the bone, where they began extracting marrow with the same relentless precision. By the time they had finished with his first limb, Gohan had mentally retreated. He couldn't take the pain anymore. Drawing from the teachings of Piccolo, Gohan slipped into a deep meditative state, a trance his former master had taught him long ago. It wasn't perfect, and he wasn't an expert by any means, but it helped him disconnect from the agony to some degree. He could still feel it, sharp, searing pain whenever they cut or extracted, but the trance dulled it, turning it into a distant throb rather than unbearable torment. Occasionally, a grunt or low moan would escape him, especially when they moved to his left arm, the more sensitive side. The trance didn't block everything, and Gohan was painfully aware of every move the doctors made. He could hear their hushed whispers as they worked, talking amongst themselves in a language he couldn't fully grasp. From what he could understand, they were trying to figure out if a Saiyan's body had unique layers between their muscles, something that separated them from other species. They seemed to be searching for untainted DNA that hadn't been corrupted by the poison they had injected into his bloodstream 2 days ago. Still, their exact motives remained a mystery. Gohan knew they were keeping much of their plan hidden from him, speaking in low tones whenever he was conscious. He didn't know what they hoped to achieve, but whatever it was clear they were far from finished with him. That's it for this episode, guys. If you've watched to the end, then that may be an indication that you enjoy the episode, so please drop a like so the video could reach more people. See you in the next episode. Take care.